Welcome back to Sir Ravenclaw. Tonight we're venturing deep into the heart of Appalachia, where ancient mountains hold secrets that predate recorded history. These 10 stories come directly from natives who've lived in these remote hollers their entire lives, witnessed things that defy explanation. Subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. Now let's begin with our first chilling tale. Story 1. Sarah McKinney had been a park ranger for only 6 months when she volunteered for the solo maintenance shift at Blackwater Falls. The 28-year-old from Richmond thought she'd seen everything nature could throw at her, but the remote cabins in West Virginia's deepest hollows were different. This was her first time working alone in an area so isolated that cell towers couldn't reach and GPS signals died 20 miles back. November had painted the mountains in shades of grey and rust. Sarah's assignment was simple: winterize 3 ranger cabins before the first heavy snow. 3 days, 3 cabins, plenty of time to enjoy the solitude she'd been craving since her messy divorce. The first cabin went smoothly. Drain the pipes, secure the shutters, check for animal intrusion. Standard procedure. It was at the second cabin, nestled deep in Blackwater Hollow, that things began to feel wrong. The building sat in a natural depression surrounded by ancient hemlocks that blocked most daylight even at noon. As Sarah worked on the cabin's exterior, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every few minutes, she'd glance up from her checklist, scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing. Just shadows and silence. But the silence itself was wrong. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, no wind through the branches. Even her own footsteps seemed muffled, as if the hollow itself was holding its breath. Sarah had grown up hiking Virginia's mountains. She knew forest sounds, knew when wildlife went quiet and why. This felt different, expectant. On her second day, she found them. 7 stones arranged in a perfect circle near the cabin's front porch. Each stone was roughly the size of her fist, smooth river rock that didn't belong in these mountains. They hadn't been there the day before. Sarah was certain of that. She'd walked that exact path dozens of times, and she had an eye for detail. She photographed the stones with her digital camera, then disturbed the circle. If some hiker was playing games, she wasn't interested. But as she worked inside the cabin, draining the kitchen pipes, she heard something that made her freeze. Whispering, soft, rhythmic sounds in a language she didn't recognize, coming from somewhere outside. Sarah grabbed her flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The whispering stopped immediately. In the beam of her light, the 7 stones had returned to their perfect circle, exactly as she'd found them that morning. Her hands shook as she gathered the stones again, this time hurling them individually into the surrounding forest. She heard each one crash through branches, thud against tree trunks. No way they were coming back. That night, sleeping in her tent 50 yards from the cabin, Sarah woke to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps circling her campsite. But when she unzipped the tent flap and shined her light outward, she saw only the 7 stones, arranged in their perfect circle, around her tent. The whispers came again, closer now. Cherokee. She realized suddenly that the sounds were Cherokee words, though she'd never heard the language spoken. Somehow, impossibly, she understood fragments. Watching. Waiting. Stranger. Sarah packed her gear with shaking hands and moved her camp to the ranger truck. She sat in the driver's seat until dawn, doors locked, engine running for warmth. When the sun finally broke through the canopy, she saw something that made her stomach clench with terror. Pressed against every window of the cabin were handprints, dozens of them, in what looked like mud or clay. But it was the details that horrified her. The prints were human-shaped, but wrong. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, and in the center of each print was a spiral symbol she'd seen in Cherokee petroglyphs. Sarah's camera captured everything, but when she tried to review the photos later, the memory card showed only corrupted files. Static and digital snow where the images should have been. She completed her work on the 3rd cabin in record time, desperate to leave Blackwater Hollow. But as she loaded her equipment into the truck for the final time, she saw movement in her peripheral vision. 50 feet away at the edge of the tree line stood a figure. It looked human at first glance, tall, lean, wearing what appeared to be buckskin clothing. But as Sarah focused on it, the details became wrong. The limbs were too long, the head tilted at an impossible angle. and the eyes reflected her headlight beams like an animal's. The figure raised one impossibly long arm and waved, a slow, deliberate gesture that somehow conveyed both greeting and warning. Sarah understood without words that she was being allowed to leave. This time, she drove out of Blackwater Hollow without looking back, but she could feel those reflective eyes watching her until she reached the main road. In her rearview mirror, the hollow seemed darker than the surrounding forest, as if it existed in permanent twilight. Sarah requested a transfer the following week. She never spoke officially about what happened in Blackwater Hollow, but she did some research. The Cherokee had stories about that place, ancient stories about the Kituwa, the Watchers who protected sacred sites from intruders. According to tribal history, Blackwater Hollow had been a burial ground for medicine men, a place where the veil between worlds grew thin. The stones, she learned, were called seeing stones, markers left by the Watchers to indicate their presence, and the handprints were signatures, claiming territory and warning outsiders that they had been observed, judged, and provisionally accepted. Sarah never returned to those mountains, but sometimes, on quiet nights, she still hears Cherokee whispers in languages she doesn't speak, but somehow understands. And occasionally, when she's feeling watched, she finds 7 smooth river stones arranged in a perfect circle outside her Richmond apartment. The Watchers, it seems, never truly let go of those they've marked. Story 2. James Hatfield had coal dust in his blood. 4th-generation Pike County, Kentucky miner, he'd worked every active shaft in the region over his 27 years underground. But the Blackbird mine had been sealed since 1952, and Jimmy had never set foot inside until the night he heard the singing. The call came in on a Tuesday evening. State mining inspector needed someone familiar with the old tunnel systems to investigate reports of unusual acoustic disturbances coming from the sealed entrance. Hikers camping nearby complained about voices echoing from inside the mountain at night. Probably just whined through the shafts, but regulations required investigation before tourists got spooked and started spreading ghost stories. Jimmy knew better than most that abandoned mines made strange sounds. Settling timbers, water drips, air pressure changes. He'd heard them all. But 20 minutes into Blackbird's main tunnel, helmet light cutting through decades of darkness, he heard something that made him stop dead. Harmony. Pure, 4-part harmony echoing from somewhere deep in the mountain's belly. Men's voices singing dark as a dungeon, the old mining ballad his grandfather had hummed while getting ready for work. The voices were faint but clear, carrying through the tunnel system with impossible acoustics. Jimmy's radio crackled with static, no signal this deep. He was alone with the singing, and it was getting stronger. He followed the sound deeper into the mine, past chambers he recognized from old safety maps. The temperature dropped noticeably as he descended, his breath forming vapor clouds in the LED beam. The voices multiplied. What started as a quartet became a full chorus, dozens of men singing in perfect harmony. Jimmy recognized every song. 16 Tons, Coal Miner's Blues, The Ballad of Spring Hill. Songs his father had taught him, songs that went back generations in these mountains. At the intersection of 2 main tunnels, Jimmy found the source, or thought he did. His helmet light illuminated an open chamber where the singing was loudest, but the beam revealed only empty space. Rock walls. Wooden support beams black with age, no people. Yet the voices surrounded him, coming from the very walls themselves. Jimmy's breathing quickened. He'd worked mines long enough to know about gas pockets, oxygen deprivation, things that could make a man hallucinate. But this felt different. Real. The voices had weight, presence, and they were singing directly to him. Then he heard his name. Jimmy Hatfield, called out in his grandfather's voice, clear as if the old man was standing right beside him. "Jimmy, boy, you come home at last." His grandfather had died in this mine. March 15th, 1952. Cave-in that trapped 17 men in the lower tunnels. Bodies never recovered. Jimmy knew the story by heart, had grown up with it like a family scar, but hearing that familiar voice, warm with recognition, made his knees buckle. "Granddad?" Jimmy's voice echoed strangely in the chamber, absorbed by the rock like the mountain itself was listening. The singing stopped abruptly. Perfect silence except for Jimmy's ragged breathing and the distant drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Then, one by one, the voices returned. But now they weren't singing, they were talking. Told you he'd come looking. Hatfield boy. Just like his people. Been waiting long enough. Time to tell him what happened. Jimmy's light beam swept the chamber frantically, but he saw nothing except shadows that seemed to move independently of his illumination. The voices were everywhere and nowhere, coming from the mountain itself. We didn't die in no cave-in, Jimmy. His grandfather's voice, patient as it had been in life. Company knew them timbers was rotten, knew the lower shaft was flooding, sent us down anyway 'cause coal prices was up and safety inspections cost money. Other voices joined in, overlapping, telling fragments of the same story. 17 men trapped when the company sealed the mine entrance behind them, not to prevent cave-in, but to hide evidence of criminal negligence. Left to die in the dark while executives filed insurance claims and told families it was an unavoidable accident. Bodies down in the water tunnels, another voice explained. Been trying to tell somebody for 70 years. Can't rest proper till folks know the truth. Jimmy found himself walking deeper into the mine, following voices that seemed to move ahead of him through passages his map showed as sealed. His helmet light revealed things that shouldn't exist. Fresh timber supports, working ventilation fans, lunch pails sitting on rock ledges as if their owners had just stepped away. In the deepest chamber, Jimmy's light fell on 17 mining helmets arranged in a perfect circle. Each one bore a name he recognized from the memorial plaque outside the mine entrance. In the center of the circle, a single piece of paper weighed down with a chunk of coal. The document was perfectly preserved despite 7 decades underground. Corporate correspondence detailing bribes paid to safety inspectors, schedules moved up to avoid government oversight, explicit orders to continue mining despite structural warnings, evidence that 17 men had been murdered for profit. "Take it to the surface, Jimmy," his grandfather's voice whispered. "Tell 'em what really happened down here. Let us sing in peace." As Jimmy reached for the document, the mountain began to sing again. But this time the harmony was different. Peaceful, grateful. The voices faded gradually as he climbed back toward the surface, the document clutched in his trembling hand. Jimmy emerged from Blackbird Mine at sunrise, his helmet light no longer needed. The singing had stopped completely, replaced by normal mountain sounds. Birds calling, wind through the trees, water running somewhere in the distance. He delivered the document to state authorities that afternoon. The subsequent investigation revealed decades of cover-up, criminal negligence, and corporate manslaughter. 17 families finally learned how their fathers and husbands really died. The company responsible had been defunct for 30 years, but the truth mattered. Jimmy never returned to Blackbird Mine, but sometimes, driving past the sealed entrance on quiet evenings, he hears faint harmonies drifting from the mountain. Not the desperate singing of trapped souls, but the contented humming of men finally at rest. The mountain still sings, but now it sings lullabies instead of warnings. And sometimes when the wind is just right, Jimmy swears he can hear his grandfather's voice humming along with the evening breeze, finally able to sleep in the darkness that once held him prisoner. Story 3. Dr. Elena Martinez had spent 3 years documenting indigenous sites across Appalachia, but the hidden valley near Mount Rogers remained elusive. Local Cherokee elders spoke of it in whispers, calling it Nviamayehi, the Bone Place, a pre-Columbian ceremonial site that older maps refused to acknowledge, as if cartographers had deliberately avoided marking its location. Elena's GPS died 20 minutes into the unmarked trail. Her compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, but the path itself seemed to guide her forward, worn smooth by centuries of feet, despite being officially non-existent. Ancient rhododendrons formed a tunnel overhead, their branches intertwining in patterns that seemed too deliberate for nature. The valley opened suddenly, a circular depression maybe 200 yards across, surrounded by ridges that blocked all outside sound. Elena's first impression was of profound silence, as if she'd stepped into a natural cathedral. Her second was the smell, sweet cedar mixed with something else, something organic and old that made her think of museum storage rooms. In the valley's center stood structures that shouldn't exist. Not buildings exactly, but arrangements of stone and bone that formed geometric patterns her anthropology training couldn't categorize. Ribs from large animals, deer, bear, possibly buffalo, formed archways and spirals. Human skulls, yellowed with age, marked cardinal directions in perfect alignment with the surrounding peaks. Eleanor's camera clicked rapidly as she documented everything. The bone arrangements showed no signs of decay, despite obvious age. No scatter from scavengers, no weather damage, no moss or lichen growth. They looked freshly placed yet ancient, as if time moved differently in this hidden valley. She found the first anomaly while photographing a spiral of femur bones. Through her camera lens, the spiral appeared complete. With naked eyes, several bones were clearly missing, leaving gaps in the pattern. Elena lowered the camera, raised it again. The viewfinder showed completeness. Reality showed incompletion. The discrepancy made her dizzy. She sat heavily on a moss-covered boulder, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The boulder felt warm beneath her, warmer than the cool October air should allow. And it was humming. A low, barely audible vibration that seemed to come from deep within the stone itself. Elena stood quickly and walked to another stone structure. This one resembled an altar, flat granite slab supported by carved pillars that depicted animals she didn't recognize. Serpents with too many heads, birds with human faces, creatures that seemed to shift and change as she stared at them. On the altar's surface, symbols were carved into the stone. Not Cherokee syllabary, not any Native American petroglyphs she'd studied. These were older, more complex, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. When Eleanor tried to trace them with her finger, the stone felt ice cold despite the warmth of the surrounding air. Her digital recorder captured something her ears missed. Playing back the audio, Elena heard chanting in languages that predated known indigenous dialects. Rhythmic, hypnotic sounds that seemed to come from the stones themselves. But in the valley, she heard only silence and the distant whisper of wind through the rhododendrons. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the bone structures began to move. Subtle at first, a skull rotating slightly on its perch, ribs shifting into different alignments. Helena told herself it was optical illusion, tricks of changing light. But her camera captured the movement in real time, bones repositioning themselves according to some invisible design. The temperature dropped noticeably as sunset approached. Elena's breath formed vapor clouds. Though her thermometer read 68 degrees, she decided to leave before full darkness, but when she turned toward the valley entrance, the path had vanished. Rhododendrons formed an impenetrable wall, branches too thick to push through. Panic crept up her spine as she circled the valley's perimeter. No exit. The ridges were too steep to climb, the vegetation too dense. She was trapped in a place that officially didn't exist, with bone structures that defied both physics and archaeology. As full darkness fell, the bones began to glow. Soft phosphorescence that outlined every structure in pale green light. The symbols on the altar pulsed with the same radiance, and Elena realized they weren't just carvings. They were some kind of writing, a record of ceremonies performed in this valley for thousands of years. The chanting returned, louder now, coming from multiple directions. Eleanor saw figures moving between the bone structures, tall, gaunt shapes that seemed to be made of shadow and starlight. They wore no clothing but carried themselves with ceremonial dignity, performing rituals around the glowing bones. One figure approached Elena directly. As it drew closer, she saw it was human in basic shape, but wrong in proportion. Too tall, limbs too long, face stretched vertically as if pulled by invisible hands. When it spoke, the words formed directly in her mind without passing through her ears. You seek knowledge of the old ways. We who built this place offer knowledge, but knowledge has a price. Stay and learn become part of our eternal ceremony, or leave and forget, carrying nothing but the memory of mystery. Eleanor understood that she was being offered a choice that countless others had faced in this valley. Join the Bone Church's endless ritual, become one of the shadow figures who tended the structures through centuries of darkness, or walk away and let the valley erase itself from her memory, like it had from the maps. The temptation was almost overwhelming. To learn the secrets these structures held, to understand rituals that predated recorded history. But something in the figure's too long face warned her that knowledge came with permanent consequences. "I choose to leave," Elena whispered. The shadow figure nodded once, a gesture of respect rather than disappointment. The glowing bones began to dim, the chanting faded, and the rhododendron tunnel reappeared where solid wall had been moments before. Elena ran through the tunnel, not stopping until she reached her car. Her equipment worked normally once she left the valley's influence. GPS found satellites, compass pointed north, camera displayed normal images of ordinary forest. But when Elena reviewed her documentation later, every photograph showed empty forest. Her audio recordings contained only wind and bird calls. Her field notes, written in her own handwriting, described a perfectly normal archaeological survey of a non-existent site. Only one piece of evidence remained, a single bone fragment in her jacket pocket, small enough to be overlooked. When Elena held it up to the light, ancient symbols glowed faintly beneath the surface, and she could hear the distant sound of chanting in languages that had no names. She kept the fragment in a lead-lined box and never spoke of the bone church to anyone. But sometimes in dreams, she found herself back in that hidden valley, watching shadow figures perform ceremonies around structures of bone and stone that existed outside the normal flow of time. The valley called to her, offering knowledge and belonging, but Eleanor had made her choice, and some doors, once closed, should never be reopened. Story 4. Thomas Brewster had guided hunting parties through the George Washington National Forest for 32 years. Born and raised in Shenandoah County, he knew every deer trail, every water source, every ridge where elk might bed down for the night. But in all his decades leading city hunters through Virginia's remote wilderness, he'd never encountered anything like what stalked his group that November. The hunting party consisted of 4 men from Richmond, corporate types looking for their annual weekend of masculine bonding. Good clients, experienced enough not to shoot at shadows, wealthy enough to tip well. Tom had guided them twice before to successful harvests. This trip should have been routine. They made camp at Stony Man Overlook, a clearing that offered excellent views of surrounding valleys and easy access to game trails. The first day passed normally. Fresh deer sign everywhere, a few distant shots from other hunting parties, the usual sounds of forest life going about its business while human predators moved through their territory. It was Eddie Martinez who first mentioned feeling watched. Second day, mid-morning, tracking a 10-point buck through dense hardwood. Eddie stopped suddenly, rifle raised, scanning the tree line with the intensity of a man who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan. "Something's following us," Eddie whispered, his voice tight with controlled tension. "Been keeping pace for the last hour, always just out of sight, but I can feel it back there." Tom had learned to trust his clients' instincts, especially the military veterans. They knew the difference between paranoia and genuine threat. He listened carefully, studying the forest around them. Birds were calling normally, squirrels chattering in the canopy above. No obvious signs of disturbance. But Eddie was right about something being off. The deer sign they'd been following just stopped, not scattered by predator pressure, not diverted to water or feed, just ended, as if the animal had simply vanished mid-stride. Tom had never seen tracks disappear like that. They found the first strange print that afternoon. Pressed deep into soft mud beside a creek crossing, it looked almost human, but the proportions were wrong. Too wide, toes too long, with what appeared to be claw marks extending from each digit. The print was easily 14 inches long, bigger than any bear track Tom had seen in these mountains. "Mountain lion," suggested Rick Patterson, the group's nominal leader and heaviest drinker. Tom shook his head. Wrong shape, wrong size, and cats don't usually hunt humans anyway. He photographed the print with his digital camera, though he wasn't sure who he'd show it to. Game wardens tended to be skeptical of unusual wildlife reports. That night, something circled their camp. They heard it moving through the underbrush just beyond their firelight's reach, heavy footsteps that seemed deliberate, intelligent. Too big for deer, too quiet for bear, too steady for any animal Tom knew. When they shined flashlights into the darkness, the movement stopped immediately, but they could feel eyes watching them from the black spaces between the trees. Jim Kostecki was next to disappear. Experienced hunter, never traveled alone, always checked in every hour by radio. On the third morning, he simply wasn't where he was supposed to be. Tom found his rifle leaning against a tree, unfired, with Jim's backpack neatly placed beside it. No signs of struggle, no blood, no trail to follow. When they called for him, something called back. Jim's voice responding from somewhere deep in the forest, reassuring them that he was fine, just following a blood trail. But the voice came from different directions each time, and there was something wrong with the cadence, the pronunciation. It sounded like Jim, but not quite Jim. Eddie went missing that afternoon. Unlike Jim, Eddie fought. They found drag marks, broken branches, his rifle discarded in thick underbrush. But the drag marks led uphill, which made no sense. No predator drags prey uphill, and the gouges in the earth suggested something with massive strength had pulled a 180-pound man up a 40-degree slope. The false Eddie appeared at their campfire that evening, walking casually out of the darkness as if he'd never been gone. But Tom's blood ran cold when he saw him. Everything was almost perfect, the clothes, the face, the mannerisms. But Eddie's eyes reflected firelight like an animal's, and when he spoke, his voice carried an echo that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. "Found some interesting tracks down by the river," fake Eddie said, settling onto a log beside the fire. "Think we might have a big cat working this area, real big cat." Rick couldn't see it, didn't want to see it. Stress and alcohol had made him desperate for normal explanations. But Tom noticed that fake Eddie cast no shadow, despite sitting directly in the firelight. And when the thing that looked like Eddie smiled, Tom caught a glimpse of teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. Tom made his decision. "We're breaking camp. Now. Tonight." "What? Why?" Rick protested. "We paid for 5 days. We've barely hunted 3, and Eddie just got back." Tom ignored him, began breaking down equipment with practiced efficiency. Whatever was impersonating his clients, it wasn't human. And if it could mimic Eddie perfectly, it had probably already taken Jim too. They needed to reach the truck before it decided to complete its collection. The thing wearing Eddie's face watched Tom pack with amused interest. "Scared, old-timer? 30 years in these woods and you're spooked by a few missing hunters?" Tom met its reflected gaze directly. "I know what you are. Question is, do you know what I am?" The fake Eddie's smile widened impossibly, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Tommy Brewster, born 1962, lost your daddy to a logging accident when you were 12. Been guiding city folk through these mountains since you were 20. Married Sarah Collins, divorced 1998, no children, live alone in a trailer off Route 211. Tom's blood turned to ice. He'd never told any of his clients those details. Whatever this thing was, it had been watching him far longer than just this hunting trip. "Your turn," Tom said quietly, continuing to pack despite his shaking hands. "What are you?" The creature's form began to shift, edges blurring like heat shimmer. For a moment, Tom saw its true shape, something that might once have been human, but had been stretched and altered by centuries of feeding in these ancient mountains. Too tall, limbs too long, face that could rearrange itself to mimic any features it had studied. "I am what becomes of things that spend too long in the deep woods," it said in a voice that was no longer Eddie's. "I am what watches from the spaces between the trees. I am what your ancestors warned you about in stories you've forgotten." Tom shouldered his pack and picked up his rifle. "And I'm a man who listens to his ancestors' stories. You can keep my clients. I suspect they're already gone anyway. But I'm walking out of here and you're going to let me." The creature that had been wearing Eddie's face studied him with genuine curiosity. "What makes you think I'll honor that bargain?" Tom smiled grimly and pulled a small leather pouch from his jacket pocket. "Because my grandmother was Cherokee, and she taught me the old protections, iron filings and salt, blessed by a medicine man who remembered the real prayers. You want to test your hunger against that kind of protection?" The creature recoiled slightly at the sight of the pouch. Ancient knowledge recognized ancient defenses. After a long moment, it nodded once. "Walk then, Tommy Brewster, but stay on the marked trails and don't come back to these deep woods. Next time, your grandmother's medicine might not be enough." Tom walked through the darkness for 6 hours, following game trails by memory and moonlight. He never looked back, never deviated from the path, never responded to the voices that called his name from the surrounding forest. Jim's voice, Eddie's voice, Rick's voice, all pleading for help from creatures that had learned to wear their faces. At dawn, Tom reached his truck and drove straight to the ranger station. He reported 3 missing hunters, gave detailed coordinates, described the creature as accurately as he dared. The search teams found camping equipment, some scattered clothing, but no bodies. The official report listed the men as missing, presumed dead due to exposure. Tom never guided another hunting party into the deep wilderness. He stuck to day trips, well-marked trails, areas where cell phones worked and rescue teams could reach quickly. But sometimes, driving past the turnoff to Stony Man Overlook, he sees familiar figures hitchhiking along the roadside. Jim, Eddie, and Rick, looking exactly as they did that November weekend, thumbs out, smiling hopefully at passing cars. Tom drives past without stopping, knowing that whatever wears their faces is still hungry, still hunting for new forms to add to its collection. The mountain devil is patient. It has been feeding in these woods since before the Cherokee, before the settlers, before anyone kept records of what lived in the deepest hollows. And it will continue feeding long after the last human hunter walks these trails, wearing the faces of all those it has claimed. Story 5. Mary Beth Collins had lived in these Tennessee mountains all her 67 years, but she'd never spent a night at the old Hensley place until her cousin Ruth broke her hip. The farmhouse sat in a hollow near Cades Cove, isolated enough that cell service was spotty, and the nearest neighbor lived 3 miles down a dirt road that washed out every heavy rain. Ruth had been specific in her instructions. "Don't mind the light if you see it, Mary Beth. Been showing up for years now, moving through them woods behind the house. Harmless as can be, just don't go following after it. Some things are best left to their own business." Mary Beth had nodded and smiled, figuring her cousin's isolation had gotten the better of her. 78 years old, living alone, seeing lights in the forest, wasn't uncommon for elderly folks whose minds had started playing tricks. But Mary Beth was practical. She'd keep Ruth's house in order, tend the small garden, and ignore whatever shadows or reflections might dance through the windows. The farmhouse felt comfortable enough during daylight hours. Built in the 1890s, it had been updated over the decades but retained its original character. Wide front porch, stone chimney, windows that looked out over a pasture where Ruth's 2 remaining horses grazed peacefully. Mary Beth settled into the routine easily. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon reading in Ruth's extensive library, evening television with the sound turned up to compensate for decades of hunting rifles and farm machinery. It was on her 3rd night that she saw the light. Mary Beth was washing dishes at the kitchen sink when movement caught her eye through the window. 50 yards into the tree line, a warm yellow glow moved between the oak and hickory trees. At first glance, it looked like someone carrying a lantern, walking slowly through the forest with deliberate purpose. But the light moved wrong. Too smooth, too steady, never bobbing or swaying the way a carried lantern would. And it was the wrong color for modern flashlights, too warm and flickering, like kerosene flame or candlelight, magnified to impossible brightness. Mary Beth dried her hands and stepped onto the back porch for a better view. The light had stopped moving, hanging motionless in the darkness about 20 feet off the ground. As she watched, it began to pulse gently, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing. Ruth wasn't imagining things, Mary Beth murmured to herself. Whatever that light was, it was real enough to cast shadows on the surrounding trees. The next morning, Mary Beth walked into the woods to investigate. She found the spot where the light had hovered, marked by the distinctive lightning-struck oak she'd used as a reference point. The ground showed no disturbance, no footprints or equipment marks, but the air smelled different here, carrying a faint scent of lavender and old fabric, like opening a trunk full of vintage clothing. That evening, the light appeared again. This time, Mary Beth was ready with Ruth's old binoculars. Through the lenses, the glow resolved into something that made her hands shake. It wasn't just light. There was a figure inside it, translucent but unmistakably human. A woman in a long dress, carrying what appeared to be an old-fashioned lantern, moving through the forest with obvious urgency. The spectral woman paused frequently, holding the lantern high as if searching for something. Her head turned left and right, scanning the underbrush with desperate intensity. Even through the binoculars, Mary Beth could see the anguish in the figure's posture, the way she moved like someone who had lost something precious and refused to give up looking. On the fourth night, Mary Beth heard the voices. She was reading in Ruth's front room when the sound drifted through the walls, children's laughter, high and sweet, coming from somewhere outside. But there were no children within miles of the isolated farmhouse. The nearest family with young ones lived in town, 20 minutes by car. Mary Beth stepped onto the front porch and listened carefully. The laughter came again, from the direction of the old barn. 2 children, maybe 3, playing some kind of game in the darkness. Their voices carried the particular joy of kids who should have been in bed hours ago, but had found some wonderful excuse to stay up late. The spectral light appeared at the same moment, moving faster than before, no longer drifting aimlessly through the trees, but heading directly toward the sound of children's voices. Mary Beth watched the glowing figure emerge from the forest and approach the barn, lantern held high, calling out in a voice too faint to understand but thick with maternal desperation. The children's laughter stopped immediately. The light began to circle the barn frantically, the woman inside it clearly searching, clearly finding nothing. After several minutes, both the light and the voices faded, leaving Mary Beth alone with crickets and the distant sound of Ruth's horses shifting in their pasture. Sleep was impossible that night. Mary Beth made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed. The next morning, she drove into town and visited the Historical Society, claiming research interest in the old families who'd lived near Cades Cove. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Janet who'd grown up in the area, was happy to help. The Hensley place. Oh, that land has quite a history. Been in Ruth's family since the 1880s, but before that it belonged to the Whitman family. Tragedy there, though. Rebecca Whitman lost her 3 children to the fever epidemic of 1897. Never got over it, according to the old stories. Janet pulled out a thick folder of photocopied documents and newspaper clippings. Rebecca's husband died in the Spanish-American War just a year later. She lived alone in that house for 30 more years. Folks said she never stopped looking for her babies. Used to walk the woods at night with a lantern, calling their names. Found her body in 1929, still holding that old kerosene lantern. Mary Beth studied the faded photographs. Rebecca Whitman had been a handsome woman, with kind eyes and prematurely grey hair. In the formal portrait, she stood behind 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, ages roughly 6 to 10. The children's faces were bright with life, unaware that their photograph would outlive them by over a century. "Where were the children buried?" Mary Beth asked. Janet's expression grew somber. "That's the sad part. Fever epidemic was so bad that year, they had to bury folks quick, sometimes in unmarked graves. Family plots got confused, records were lost. Rebecca never knew exactly where her babies were laid to rest. Some say that's why she couldn't find peace, wandering those woods looking for their graves." That evening, Mary Beth waited on the back porch with a thermos of coffee and Ruth's Bible. She'd marked the passage about laying the dead to rest, though she wasn't entirely sure how scripture applied to century-old ghosts. But her grandmother had always said, the good book had guidance for every situation, even the ones that defied rational explanation. The light appeared just after 10 o'clock, moving through the forest with its characteristic urgency. Mary Beth stood and called out, "Rebecca! Rebecca Whitman!" The glowing figure stopped immediately and turned toward the farmhouse. For the first time, Mary Beth could see the woman's face clearly, gaunt with grief, eyes that reflected decades of searching, lips moving in constant prayer or pleading. Rebecca began walking toward the porch, her lantern casting impossible shadows that moved independently of her movement. "Your children," Mary Beth called. "I know about your children." Rebecca's spectral form reached the edge of the yard and stopped, as if held back by some invisible boundary. Her mouth moved urgently, but Mary Beth heard only whispers carried on night wind. Where are my babies? Can't find them. Promised I'd find them." Mary Beth opened Ruth's Bible to the marked passage and read aloud, "He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." Rebecca's lantern flickered and dimmed. Her form became more translucent, but her desperation remained. She gestured toward the forest, toward the barn, toward spaces where she'd searched for over 90 years. Understanding came to Mary Beth suddenly. "They're not lost, Rebecca. They're waiting for you. You don't need to find them. They're waiting for you to come home." The spectral woman tilted her head, listening with the intensity of someone hearing hope for the first time in decades. "Let go," Mary Beth said gently. "Stop searching and let go. They've been waiting for you to stop wandering and come to them." Rebecca's lantern flared one final time, bright enough to illuminate the entire yard. In that moment of brilliant light, Mary Beth saw 3 small figures standing beside their mother, 2 boys and a girl, faces bright with joy, reaching up to take Rebecca's hands. The light faded slowly, warmly, like a sunset that lingered to say goodbye. When darkness returned, the forest felt different, peaceful. The constant undercurrent of grief that Mary Beth hadn't even noticed was gone, replaced by the normal sounds of night in the Tennessee mountains. Mary Beth never saw the widow's light again during her month at the Hensley place, but sometimes walking in the woods behind the house, she caught the faint scent of lavender on the evening breeze, and she knew that Rebecca Whitman had finally found what she'd been searching for all those years. When Ruth returned from her rehabilitation, she noticed the change immediately. "Feels different here," she said, settling into her favorite chair. "Peaceful-like. That light still showing up in the woods?" Mary Beth smiled and poured her cousin a cup of coffee. "No," she said. "I think she found what she was looking for." Story 6. Marcus Washington had been working emergency medical services for 18 years, but the rural clinic near Asheville was his first assignment in the deep mountains of North Carolina. City-trained, Atlanta-born, he'd moved to Appalachia for the slower pace and better pay that came with serving underserved communities. What he hadn't expected was how different mountain medicine could be from anything he'd learned in paramedic school. The storm hit on his 3rd week of night shifts, the kind of late October weather that turned mountain roads into rivers and left half the county without power. Marcus was alone at the clinic, monitoring the radio for emergency calls that might require ambulance response. The backup generator hummed quietly in the basement, keeping essential equipment running while wind howled through the valleys like something alive and angry. It was near midnight when he found the first bundle. Stepping outside to check the generator's fuel level, Marcus nearly tripped over a collection of roots and herbs tied together with red string. The bundle sat directly in front of the clinic's main entrance, positioned with obvious intention. Marcus had seen enough drug cases to recognize ginseng, but the other plants were unfamiliar. Twisted roots that looked almost like tiny human figures, leaves that gave off a sharp medicinal smell, and something that might have been animal bones wrapped in the center. Marcus photographed the bundle with his phone and moved it to the side of the building. Probably some local folk medicine practitioner making a statement about modern healthcare. He'd dealt with similar cultural conflicts in Atlanta, though usually involving Santeria altars rather than Appalachian root work. The radio crackled with his first call 20 minutes later. Animal attack in Cane Creek, 10 miles up a winding mountain road that Google Maps showed as barely more than a dirt track. The caller, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hensley, reported that something had mauled her neighbor's cattle and was now circling her house. Marcus loaded the ambulance and drove into the storm, following GPS directions that led him deeper into the mountains than he'd ever been. The Hensley house sat in a hollow so isolated that his radio lost signal completely. No cell service, no backup communication, just him and his medical training against whatever emergency awaited. Mrs. Hensley was 70-something, thin as a rail, with eyes that held the sharp intelligence of mountain folk who'd survived decades of hardship. She met Marcus at her front door with a shotgun in her hands and fear in her weathered face. "Ain't no animal attack," she said, without preamble. "Something's got stirred up that shouldn't have been stirred. Been expecting somebody like you to come along." She led Marcus to her neighbor's property, where 3 head of cattle lay scattered across the pasture. But these weren't typical predator kills. The animals had been torn apart with impossible violence, scattered in patterns that seemed almost ritualistic. And there were no tracks. No paw prints, no blood trail, nothing to indicate what kind of creature could have caused such destruction. "Where's your neighbor?" Marcus asked, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. "Dead 3 days now," Mrs. Hensley replied matter-of-factly. "Heart attack, they said. But Jake Parsons had a heart strong as an ox, never been sick a day in his life till last week." As if summoned by her words, something howled in the distance. Not a wolf or coyote, but something that sounded like human voices mixed with animal rage. The sound came from multiple directions, as if they were surrounded by a pack of creatures that could throw their voices like ventriloquists. Mrs. Hensley grabbed Marcus's arm with surprising strength. "You got any protection on you, boy? Any conjure work or blessed items?" Marcus shook his head, confused by the question. "I'm a paramedic, ma'am. I have medical supplies, but I'm not sure what you mean by protection." The old woman's face went pale in his flashlight beam. "Lord help us. They sent someone without any defenses at all." She hurried him back to her house, locking multiple deadbolts and drawing heavy curtains across every window. The interior was lit by kerosene lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls covered with strange symbols drawn in what looked like chalk or clay. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with scents both medicinal and mystical. "Sit down and listen," Mrs. Hensley commanded, settling into a rocking chair that had probably been in her family for generations. "My grandmother was what folks called a root doctor. Learned the old ways from her grandmother, who learned from Cherokee medicine women and African conjure workers. Healing arts, protection magic, ways to keep the dark things at bay." Marcus wanted to protest, to explain that he dealt in evidence-based medicine, not superstition, but the genuine terror in the old woman's eyes stopped him. Whatever was happening in these mountains, she believed in it completely. "Jake Parsons got himself into something he couldn't handle," she continued. "Found some old bottles buried behind his house, thought they might be valuable antiques, dug them up despite my warnings, broke the seals that had kept them buried for near a century." The howling came again, closer now, accompanied by the sound of something large moving through the underbrush around the house. Mrs. Hensley's hands tightened on a bundle of roots and feathers that hung around her neck. "What was in the bottles?" Marcus asked, finding himself drawn into her narrative despite his skepticism. "Conjure work gone wrong. Back in the 1920s, there was a root doctor named Solomon Barnes. Powerful man, but he got greedy, started using his gifts for harm instead of healing, made enemies, broke the old laws. When the community finally came for him, he bound his anger and revenge into those bottles, buried them with wards that were supposed to last forever." Something scratched at the walls of the house, long scraping sounds that suggested claws larger than any natural animal. The kerosene flames flickered despite the absence of any wind inside the sealed house. "What Jake unleashed ain't natural anymore," Mrs. Hensley whispered. "Solomon's rage, twisted by decades underground, manifesting as things that hunger for violence. They killed Jake first, then started working on his livestock. Now they're looking for more targets." Marcus's radio suddenly crackled to life, receiving a signal despite being out of range. His own voice came through the speaker, calling for backup, reporting multiple casualties. But he hadn't made that call. He was sitting in Mrs. Hensley's living room, listening to something broadcast a perfect imitation of his voice. "They're trying to lure more people up here," the old woman explained. "Fed on Jake's life force, now they want fresh victims, and you came right to them, unprotected and ignorant." The scratching at the walls intensified, accompanied by voices that sounded almost human. Pleas for help, cries of pain, the kinds of sounds that would make any paramedic rush outside to render aid. But Mrs. Hensley held Marcus back with an iron grip. "Don't listen to them. That's how they get you. They mimic voices, play on your need to help people. But there ain't nothing out there but hunger and hate wearing familiar sounds." Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from his supervisor. "Multiple casualties reported at your location. Why haven't you responded?" But his supervisor didn't work nights, and Marcus hadn't reported any casualties. "How do we stop them?" Marcus asked, his medical training warring with growing acceptance of something beyond his understanding. Mrs. Hensley reached into a wooden box beside her chair and pulled out items that looked like the bundle Marcus had found at the clinic. "Protection first, then binding. But it takes someone with the gift to do the real work. I'm too old, and you don't know the ways." She handed Marcus a small cloth bag filled with roots, stones, and what felt like bone fragments. "Keep this on you. It won't stop them, but it might slow them down long enough for help to arrive." "What kind of help?" "The kind your people sent, whether they knew it or not." Mrs. Hensley smiled grimly. "That bundle you found at the clinic? That was Mama Reeves's work. She's the real root doctor in these parts, been tracking Solomon's bottles for years. She knew someone would eventually dig them up, knew the hospital would send someone to deal with the aftermath. As if summoned by her words, headlights appeared through the curtained windows, followed by the sound of an old truck pulling into the yard. The scratching and howling stopped immediately, replaced by sounds of retreat, things fleeing back into the deep woods. An elderly black woman entered the house without knocking, carrying a bag that smelled of herbs and old earth. She looked at Marcus with eyes that seemed to see more than just his physical presence. "You the paramedic?" she asked. When Marcus nodded, she continued, "Good. Gonna need someone with steady hands for what comes next. Mrs. Hensley, you got the binding materials ready?" What followed was 3 hours of work that existed somewhere between medical procedure and ritual ceremony. Mama Reeves led them to the site where Jake Parsons had dug up Solomon Barnes's bottles, where the ground still radiated an unnatural coldness despite the October warmth. Using techniques that weren't taught in any medical school, they gathered the scattered fragments of broken glass and reassembled them using a mixture of clay, blood, and compounds that Marcus couldn't identify. His role was to maintain sterile conditions and monitor vital signs, not of patients but of the ritual itself, watching for signs that the binding was taking hold. As dawn broke over the mountains, the last bottle was sealed and reburied, this time with protections designed to last centuries rather than decades. The unnatural cold faded from the ground, replaced by normal earth warmth. "It's done," Mama Reeves announced, wiping her hands on a cloth that immediately began to smolder. "Solomon's rage is contained again. Won't be bothering folks for another generation or two." Marcus drove back to the clinic as the sun rose, his radio working normally, his phone showing no mysterious messages. The bundle of protective herbs sat in his pocket, like a tangible reminder that the world contained more mysteries than medical school had prepared him for. He never reported what had happened that night, couldn't have explained it in terms that would make sense to his supervisors, but he kept the herb bundle, and when Mrs. Hensley brought him homemade soup the following week, he accepted it with gratitude and respect. The mountains had taught him that healing sometimes required more than medical training. Sometimes it required understanding that certain knowledge had been passed down through generations for very good reasons, and that wisdom could come from sources his education had never acknowledged. Marcus Washington became a better paramedic after that night, more attuned to the communities he served, more respectful of traditions he didn't fully understand. And when other medical personnel asked about the small cloth bag he always carried, he simply smiled and said it was a local custom. Some protection he'd learned was worth more than skepticism. Story 7. Rebecca Sharp had documented ghost towns across 3 states, but Millfield in Logan County, West Virginia, was different from the beginning. Her camera seemed heavier as she hiked up the abandoned railroad grade, and the October air carried sounds that didn't belong to any living forest. Mechanical noises, distant and rhythmic, like machinery running somewhere in the empty valley ahead. The documentary filmmaker had chosen Millfield for her project on industrial abandonment because of its tragic history. A coal company town that died overnight in 1952 when an underground fire killed 37 miners and made the entire area uninhabitable. The company had sealed the mine shafts and evacuated the town within a week, leaving behind a perfect snapshot of 1950s Appalachian life frozen in time. Becca's research showed that Millfield had been home to nearly 200 people before the disaster. Company houses lined both sides of the main street, a company store anchored the town center, and the massive tipple dominated the valley like a wooden cathedral. According to county records, everything had been left exactly as it was when the evacuation order came down. But as Becca crested the hill and got her first view of the town, something felt wrong. Smoke rose from several chimneys despite the October warmth. Lights flickered in windows of houses that had been without electricity for 70 years, and the mechanical sounds were louder now, clearly coming from the direction of the sealed coal tipple. Becca adjusted her camera settings and began filming, narrating as she walked toward the first row of houses. "This is Millfield, West Virginia, abandoned since 1952, following the Millfield mine disaster. What I'm seeing contradicts every historical account I've researched. There appears to be recent activity in what should be a completely deserted town." The first house she approached had a perfectly maintained front yard. Garden tools leaned against the porch railing, a child's bicycle sat in the driveway, and laundry hung from a clothesline in the backyard. But the laundry was styles from the 1950s, house dresses, men's work shirts, children's overalls, all faded as if they'd been hanging in the mountain sun for decades. Through the front window, Becca could see movement inside the house. A woman in a floral dress moved between rooms, cleaning or organizing, her actions visible in brief glimpses as she passed the windows. But when Becca knocked on the front door, the movement stopped immediately. No answer, no acknowledgement of her presence. She tried the door handle, unlocked. The interior looked exactly like a 1950s company house should look, down to the calendar on the kitchen wall showing March 1952. But everything was covered in a fine layer of coal dust, and the air smelled of smoke and metal, as if the underground fire was still burning somewhere beneath the floorboards. Becca filmed everything, documenting the anachronistic details that suggested recent habitation in a supposedly abandoned town. Fresh food in the refrigerator, though the power had been cut decades ago. A coffee pot still warm on the stove, though no gas lines served the area anymore. Newspapers dated March 15th, 1952, the day of the mine disaster, spread on the kitchen table as if someone had been reading them that morning. In the living room, Becca found photographs on the mantelpiece, family portraits showing a man in mining clothes, a woman in house dresses, 3 children of various ages. But the photographs were wrong somehow. The faces were too uniform, expressions too identical, as if the same person had posed for every picture while wearing different clothes. The mechanical sounds grew louder as Becca moved deeper into the town. She followed the noise toward the mine tipple, filming continuously as more evidence of impossible habitation revealed itself, windows glowing with warm light in houses that had no power source, gardens growing vegetables that should have been killed by early frost, children's voices calling from backyards where no children should exist. At the company store, Becca found the front door propped open and the interior lit by kerosene lamps. Shelves were stocked with goods from the 1950s, prices marked in pencil on brown paper tags, but when she picked up a can of peaches, her hand passed through it like it was made of light and shadow. The can remained on the shelf, solid and real, while her camera recorded her hand moving through empty air. Behind the counter, a man in suspenders and a white shirt worked at an old cash register, making entries in a ledger book. He looked up when Becca entered, smiled pleasantly, and asked what he could help her find. But his voice came from far away, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "I'm documenting the town," Becca said, raising her camera, "for a historical preservation project." The store clerk nodded approvingly. "Good to see young folks taking interest in the old ways. Town's been quiet lately, but we keep things running just the same. Community depends on it." Becca tried to engage him in conversation about the mine disaster, the evacuation, what had happened to the town. But the clerk's responses circled around her questions without ever addressing them directly. He spoke about normal daily business, regular customers, the importance of keeping the community together, as if the mine disaster had never happened, as if the town had never been abandoned. When Becca reviewed her footage later, the clerk wasn't visible on camera. The store appeared empty, shelves bare, cash register covered with decades of dust. But the audio track clearly recorded both sides of their conversation. The mechanical sounds led Becca to the mine tipple, where she found the source of her growing unease. The massive wooden structure was fully operational, conveyor belts moving coal from underground to waiting rail cars. Men in mining gear worked the machinery with practiced efficiency, calling instructions to each other in voices that echoed strangely in the autumn air. But the rail cars were rusted hulks that hadn't moved since 1952, and the conveyor belts carried nothing but empty air. The workers wore the faces of men from the photographs Becca had seen in the company houses, identical expressions of focused concentration repeated across dozens of different bodies. Becca filmed the impossible scene, watching her camera record men who weren't quite there operating machinery that wasn't quite real. But the sounds were authentic, metal grinding against metal, steam hissing from engines, workers shouting over industrial noise that hadn't been heard in this valley for 70 years. One of the workers noticed her filming and walked over, coal dust covering his face except for pale streaks around his eyes where safety goggles should have been. He smiled the same pleasant smile she'd seen on the store clerk. "You documenting our work?" he asked. "Good to have witnesses. Important that folks remember what we accomplished here." "The mine closed in 1952, Becca said carefully. "There was a fire. People died." The worker's smile never wavered. "Fire's still burning down below. Always will be. But work goes on. Community needs the coal, families need the wages. Can't let a little setback stop progress." He gestured toward the other workers, all of whom had stopped their activities to look at Becca with identical expressions of friendly interest. "We've got good people here, hard workers, dedicated to the job. Town runs smooth as long as everybody does their part." Becca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What part do you want me to do?" "Same thing you're already doing," the worker replied. "Documenting, recording, making sure the story gets told right. Town needs folks who can show the outside world how things really work here." The worker reached out and touched Becca's camera. Where his fingers made contact, the metal felt ice cold, and her viewfinder filled with static. When the image cleared, she was no longer looking at the abandoned tipple, but at the fully operational mine of 1952, complete with working machinery and dozens of miners going about their daily tasks. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the worker said. "The way things used to be, the way things still are, for those who understand. You could help us tell that story. Stay and document the real Millfield, the town that never died." Becca understood suddenly that she was being offered a choice. Join the community of people who had refused to accept the mine disaster, who continued their daily routines in a town that existed somewhere between memory and reality. Her documentation skills would be put to use, showing the world that Millfield lived on, that the coal company's decision to abandon the town had been premature. But looking through her camera at the workers' identical faces, Becca realized that staying would mean becoming like them. Another smiling figure going through the motions of life in a place where time had stopped on March 15th, 1952. "I need to go," Becca said, lowering her camera. "I have other projects, other towns to document." The worker's smile faded slightly. "That's disappointing. We were hoping you'd see the potential here, the community we've built." Becca backed away from the tipple, filming continuously as the operational mine faded back into rusted abandonment. The workers vanished like morning mist, leaving only empty structures and the sound of wind through broken machinery. She drove out of Millfield as quickly as the mountain roads would allow, not stopping until she reached the main highway. When she reviewed her footage that evening, most of it showed exactly what it should have: an abandoned coal town slowly being reclaimed by forest, empty houses, broken windows, machinery rusted beyond repair. But scattered throughout the normal footage were brief glimpses of the other Millfield. Lights in windows, smoke from chimneys, people going about their daily business in a town that had died 70 years ago. And in every shot where people appeared, they wore the same pleasant smile, the same expression of community satisfaction. Becca never completed her documentary about industrial abandonment. The footage from Millfield made her question what she'd actually experienced, what she'd imagined, what her camera had recorded versus what had really been there. But she kept the footage, storing it in a safety deposit box, along with a written account of her experience. Sometimes late at night while working on other projects, Becca found herself thinking about the workers' offer. A community where everyone had a role, where important work continued despite external setbacks, where dedication to shared purpose created its own reality. The thought terrified her because part of her found it appealing. The idea of belonging to something permanent, something that refused to accept defeat or abandonment. But she'd seen the price of that belonging in the identical faces of the hollow men who kept Millfield running long after it should have died. Becca Sharp continued documenting ghost towns across Appalachia, but she never returned to Logan County. Some stories she'd learned were too dangerous to tell completely, and some communities were too dedicated to accept that their time had passed. Story 8. David Sequoia had grown up hearing his grandmother's stories about the Moon-Eyed people, but he'd always assumed they were metaphorical tales meant to teach lessons about respect for the land. As a tribal historian for the Eastern Band Cherokee, David documented oral traditions with academic rigor, separating cultural wisdom from literal historical claims. But the cave system near Brasstown Bald challenged everything he thought he understood about Cherokee legends. The assignment came from the Tribal Council. Recent construction near Georgia's highest peak had uncovered cave entrances that matched descriptions from the oldest stories. Caves where the Pale people had supposedly lived before the Cherokee arrived, dwelling in darkness because sunlight burned their sensitive eyes. The council wanted documentation before archaeologists from the university arrived with their own theories and interpretations. David approached the project with professional skepticism. Ancient peoples had indeed lived in these mountains before Cherokee settlement, but the descriptions of pale, large-eyed beings sounded more like folklore than anthropological reality. Still, cave paintings and artifacts could provide valuable insights into pre-Columbian cultures, regardless of how later storytellers had embellished the historical record. The main cave entrance was larger than David had expected, a natural limestone arch hidden behind rhododendron thickets that would have been invisible to casual hikers. His headlamp revealed passages that extended far beyond what surface topography suggested possible. The cave system seemed to burrow directly into the heart of Brasstown Bald, following underground streams that had carved tunnels through solid rock over millennia. David's equipment recorded everything as he descended into the cave system. Temperature readings, air quality measurements, photographic documentation of geological formations. Standard archaeological protocol for an initial survey. But 20 minutes into the cave, his instruments began registering anomalies that didn't correspond to known cave phenomena. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a matter of steps, with no change in elevation or air circulation to explain the sudden cooling. His digital camera's flash reflected off surfaces that appeared to be polished stone, walls that showed tool marks too precise for primitive implements. And the air carried scents that didn't belong underground. Pine smoke, clay pottery, cooking fires that suggested recent habitation. The first cave paintings appeared at a junction where 3 passages converged, but these weren't the simple petroglyphs David expected from ancient cultures. The artwork showed sophisticated understanding of perspective, depth, and anatomical detail that rivaled medieval European illuminated manuscripts. Figures depicted in the paintings were undeniably human in basic structure, but the proportions were wrong. The painted people were tall and thin, with elongated limbs and heads that seemed too large for their bodies. Most distinctive were their eyes, enormous dark orbs that dominated their pale faces. They wore no clothing but adorned themselves with elaborate jewelry made from what appeared to be crystals and metals. The paintings showed them engaged in activities that suggested advanced civilization, agriculture, metallurgy, astronomical observation. David photographed everything, narrating his observations for the audio recorder. Cave paintings showing human figures with unusual anatomical characteristics. Artistic style suggests much more recent creation than expected for pre-Columbian cultures. Possible evidence of European contact, though subject matter doesn't match known historical interactions. But as David studied the paintings more closely, details emerged that challenged his rational explanations. The metalwork depicted in the artwork showed techniques that weren't developed in Europe until the Renaissance. The astronomical charts were more accurate than anything produced by Cherokee or neighboring tribes, and the style, while sophisticated, used pigments and methods that predated European contact by centuries. Deeper in the cave system, David found evidence of actual habitation. Living spaces carved from solid rock with sleeping alcoves, storage areas, and cooking hearths that showed signs of recent use. The ashes in the fire pits were cold but not ancient, maybe weeks or months old rather than centuries. Fresh water flowed through channels carved into the cave floor, and ventilation shafts provided air circulation that kept the atmosphere breathable despite the depth underground. David's rational mind struggled to process what he was documenting. The Cherokee stories spoke of the moon-eyed people as ancient inhabitants who had been driven underground by the arrival of David's own ancestors. But this evidence suggested ongoing habitation, a hidden community that had survived in these caves for hundreds of years. The pottery he found in the storage areas was unlike anything in Cherokee tradition or southeastern archaeology. Vessels made from clay that had been fired to incredible hardness, decorated with symbols that resembled both Cherokee syllabary and unknown writing systems. Some pottery contained preserved foods, roots, berries, and meat that should have spoiled long ago, but remained fresh as if recently prepared. David was photographing a particularly elaborate storage chamber when he heard the voices. Soft conversation in a language he didn't recognize, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave system. The speakers sounded young, children perhaps, talking quietly among themselves with the casual familiarity of people engaged in routine activities. Following the voices deeper into the caves, David discovered a vast underground chamber, lit by some source he couldn't identify. Not firelight or electric illumination, but a steady, cool radiance that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. In the center of the chamber, 3 figures sat around what appeared to be a low table, engaged in some kind of craft work. David's first impulse was to call out, to identify himself and explain his presence. But something about the scene made him hesitate, stay hidden behind a rock formation while he observed. The figures were children, maybe 8 to 12 years old, but their proportions matched the cave paintings exactly. Tall for their apparent age, thin limbs and heads that seemed oversized. And their eyes, even from a distance, David could see that their eyes were enormous, dark pools that reflected the cave's mysterious lighting. The children worked with materials David couldn't identify, shaping what looked like crystal formations into complex geometric patterns. Their movements were precise, deliberate, suggesting skills developed over years of practice. They spoke occasionally in their unknown language, voices high and musical, carrying clearly across the chamber's acoustic space. One of the children looked up suddenly, staring directly at David's hiding place, despite the fact that he'd made no sound. The child's enormous eyes seemed to glow with their own light, and David felt a strange sensation, as if his thoughts were being gently examined by an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly foreign. The child spoke a single word in Cherokee, Osio, the traditional greeting. David understood that he'd been detected and that hiding was pointless. He stepped out from behind the rock formation, hands visible and empty, trying to project peaceful intentions. The 3 children regarded him with curious interest rather than fear. The one who had spotted him first stood and approached, moving with fluid grace that seemed almost choreographed. Up close, David could see that the child's features were indeed human, but refined beyond normal variation. Bone structure that suggested both extreme beauty and subtle wrongness, as if humanity had been perfected by something that didn't quite understand what humanity was supposed to be. "You are Cherokee," the child said in accented but clear English, "like the ones who came before seeking knowledge of the old ways." David nodded, finding his voice with difficulty. "I'm documenting the stories my grandmother told about the people who lived here before us." The child smiled, an expression that was both welcoming and infinitely sad. "We are those people, the ones your ancestors called moon-eyed, because we could not bear the brightness of the surface world. We have lived in these deep places for many generations, keeping the old knowledge safe." The other 2 children joined their companion, forming a semicircle around David. He realized that despite their apparent youth, there was something ancient in their manner, a gravity that suggested far more experience than their physical appearance indicated. "Your stories say we were driven away," one of the other children said, "but driving away and going into hiding are different things. We chose to preserve what we could in places where time moves differently, where the old ways could continue without interference." David understood that he was being offered unprecedented access to living representatives of the moon-eyed people, beings who had transitioned from Cherokee legend into documented reality. But he also sensed that this revelation came with responsibilities and risks that his academic training hadn't prepared him for. "What knowledge are you preserving?" he asked. The first child gestured toward the chamber's walls, where David now noticed elaborate carvings and symbols that covered every available surface. Records of the time before, when the barriers between worlds were thinner. Maps of places that exist beside your reality but not within it. Methods for working with stone and metal and crystal that your science has not yet rediscovered. The child paused, studying David with those enormous, luminous eyes. "And guardianship of things that were left in our care when other ancient peoples departed these mountains. Artifacts that would be dangerous in the wrong hands, knowledge that could cause great harm if misused." David realized that the Moon-Eyed Children weren't just preserving Cherokee prehistory. They were active guardians of forces and objects that predated human presence in the Americas. The cave system wasn't just a hidden community, but a repository for powers that had been deliberately removed from the surface world. Your grandmother knew, the child continued. The old Cherokee women understood that some knowledge must be kept hidden. Some responsibilities must be carried by those who can bear the burden. You carry that bloodline, that understanding. That's why you found us when others have searched and found only empty caves. The children led David deeper into their underground domain, showing him chambers filled with artifacts that defied easy categorization, crystal formations that generated their own light, metal objects that seemed to bend space around themselves, carvings that moved and changed when viewed from different angles. Each item was carefully maintained, catalogued according to systems that predated written language. "We are not the only guardians," one of the children explained as they toured the collection. "Others keep different aspects of the old knowledge safe in hidden places throughout these mountains, but we specialize in the artifacts, the physical remnants of civilizations that existed before the current age." David understood that he was being invited into a secret that stretched far beyond Cherokee oral tradition, a network of hidden communities, each preserving different aspects of knowledge that the surface world wasn't ready to rediscover. The Moon-Eyed Children were just one node in a vast system of guardianship that had operated in the shadows for centuries. When it came time to leave, the children escorted David back to the main cave entrance, but before they parted, the first child handed him a small crystal pendant, perfectly clear except for symbols that seemed to move within its structure. "This will let you return when you need to," the child said, "and it will protect you if others seek to misuse the knowledge you've gained. But remember, some truths are meant to be preserved, not shared. Your role is to guard the guardians, not expose them." David emerged from the cave system as the sun was setting over Brasstown Bald. His equipment had recorded everything normally until he'd encountered the children, then showed only empty caves and standard geological formations. But the crystal pendant remained solid and real in his pocket, proof that his experience had been more than academic research. He wrote his report for the tribal council carefully, documenting the cave paintings and artifacts while omitting any mention of living inhabitants. The university archaeologists who followed found exactly what David's official documentation described: evidence of ancient habitation, sophisticated artwork, and mysterious cultural artifacts that raised more questions than they answered. But David kept the pendant, and sometimes when the moon was dark and the mountains called to him, he returned to the caves. The Moon-Eyed Children welcomed him as a colleague, sharing knowledge and responsibilities that connected Cherokee tradition to mysteries far older than human memory. David Sequoia had started his career documenting the past, but the Moon-Eyed Children taught him that some histories were still being written in hidden places, where time moved according to different rules. And some knowledge was too important to be preserved in books or museums. It required living guardians who understood that truth and responsibility were inseparable. Story 9. Catherine Morrison had traced bloodlines across 3 continents, but the genealogy request that brought her to Newman's Ridge in Tennessee was unlike anything she'd encountered in 15 years of professional research. Her client, a wealthy businessman from Atlanta, wanted to prove his connection to the mysterious Melungeon people, the mixed heritage mountain community whose origins had puzzled historians for centuries. The project seemed straightforward until Kat began finding the deaths. Not just ordinary mortality, but a pattern of strange accidents and unexplained illnesses that had plagued certain family lines for over 200 years. Every generation, without exception, suffered losses that defied statistical probability. The more she researched, the more convinced she became that someone or something had deliberately cursed specific Melungeon bloodlines. Kat had rented a cabin on Newman's Ridge, the isolated mountain where Melungeon families had settled in the 1790s. The area still felt separate from the modern world, connected to the valley below by narrow roads that twisted through forests older than recorded history. Cell service was non-existent. Internet came through a satellite connection that worked when weather permitted, and the nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away. The local historical society had provided boxes of documents dating back to the earliest Melungeon settlements, birth records, death certificates, land deeds, and census data that told the story of a people who didn't fit neat racial categories. Portuguese, Turkish, Cherokee, African, Scottish, the Melungeons carried bloodlines from multiple continents, creating a unique culture that faced persecution from all directions. But woven through the official records, Kat found evidence of something darker, a pattern of curses, hexes, and supernatural retribution that the Melungeon families had faced from the moment they settled on Newman's Ridge. The earliest documents mentioned conflicts with mountain witches, who claimed the ridge as sacred ground and promised vengeance against any who disturbed their ancient sites. Kat's client, Jonathan Vardy, descended from one of the most prominent Melungeon families. The Vardys had been leaders in the community, successful farmers and business owners who'd fought legal battles to establish their rights as free people of color. But they'd also suffered more than their share of tragedy. Children born with genetic disorders, adults dying in bizarre accidents, business ventures failing due to impossible coincidences. The genealogical research revealed that Jonathan's bloodline could be traced directly to Vardy Collins, one of the original Melungeon settlers. But it also revealed that Vardy Collins had made powerful enemies during his lifetime. Specifically, a woman named Mahala Mullins, who practiced what colonial records called Negro conjure work, and who had reportedly cursed the Collins family for reasons the documents didn't specify. Kat found Mahala's story in court records from 1798. Accused of witchcraft and theft, she'd been banished from the settlements and told never to return. But before leaving, she'd stood in the center of what would become Newman's Ridge and spoken words that witnesses described as a curse in unknown tongues, calling on powers that Christians should not name. The curse, according to testimony, was specific and detailed. Every third generation of Collins descendants would lose their firstborn children. Every business venture would fail at the moment of greatest success. And the family would never find peace in the places they called home, always feeling the pull of distant lands and divided loyalties. Kat documented everything, building a family tree that showed the curse's effectiveness across 2 centuries. The pattern was undeniable. Every third generation, the predictions came true with mathematical precision. Jonathan Vardy was a third-generation descendant, and his only son had died in a car accident just months before his college graduation. But as Kat delved deeper into Mahala Mullins' story, she began experiencing problems of her own. Her laptop crashed repeatedly, losing hours of research despite automatic backup systems. Her printer produced documents with text that changed between printing and reading, showing family names that shifted and rearranged themselves, and her dreams became filled with visions of a tall, dark woman who watched her work with eyes that held centuries of anger. The breakthrough came when Kat found Mahala's own genealogical records. The woman accused of cursing the Melungeon families was herself of mixed heritage, African, Cherokee, and something else that the colonial authorities couldn't categorize. She'd been a healer and spiritual advisor before the conflict with Vardy Collins, respected for her knowledge of traditional medicine and protective magic. The court documents revealed the source of the conflict. Vardy Collins had seduced Mahala's teenage daughter, promising marriage, but abandoning her when she became pregnant. The girl had died in childbirth, along with the baby, after being refused help by the other settlers, who considered her father's mixed blood a contamination. Mahala's curse wasn't random malice. It was a mother's grief transformed into supernatural revenge. She'd called on powers from multiple traditions, weaving African conjure work with Cherokee spirit magic and European folk practices to create a binding that would last as long as the Collins bloodline survived. But Kat's research also revealed something that changed her understanding of the curse entirely. Mahala Mullins was her ancestor too. 3 generations back, through her grandmother's maternal line, Kat carried the same mixed heritage that had made the Melungeons targets of persecution. She wasn't just researching the curse, she was connected to both its source and its victims. The realization came with immediate consequences. Kat's health began failing in ways that doctors couldn't explain. Fatigue that no amount of rest could cure, pain that moved through her body without apparent cause, and a growing sense that something was actively working against her continued existence. The curse that had plagued the Collins family for 2 centuries was now targeting her for uncovering its secrets. Kat understood that she had a choice. She could abandon the research, return to Atlanta, and hope that distance would protect her from Mahala's supernatural vengeance. Or she could try to break a curse that had been growing stronger for over 200 years, fueled by generations of grief and maintained by the very bloodline it was designed to destroy. She chose to fight back, using the same genealogical skills that had uncovered the curse to research its potential weaknesses. Mahala had been powerful, but she'd also been human. And human magic, no matter how strong, could be undone by someone who understood its structure and origins. The solution came from Cherokee traditions that Mahala had incorporated into her curse work. According to tribal beliefs, curses lost their power when the original grievance was acknowledged and proper restitution was made. But restitution to a woman who'd been dead for 2 centuries required more than apologies. It required understanding the full scope of injustice that had created her need for revenge. Kat spent 3 days researching not just Mahala's story, but the broader history of persecution that the Melungeon people had faced. Families torn apart by racial classification laws, children denied education and opportunity, communities scattered by legal challenges to their very right to exist. The curse wasn't just about one woman's personal loss, it was about centuries of systematic oppression that had never been acknowledged or addressed. On the night of the new moon, Kat climbed to the highest point on Newman's Ridge, carrying documents that told the complete story of both the Collins family and Mahala Mullins. She'd printed everything on handmade paper using natural inks, following instructions she'd found in books about Appalachian folk magic. At the summit, Kat built a fire using wood from 7 different trees and began reading the histories aloud. Vardy Collins's story, including his abandonment of Mahala's daughter, Mahala's grief, and the injustices that had driven her to curse work. The generations of Collins descendants who'd suffered for their ancestors' crimes, and the ongoing persecution that the Melungeon people had faced throughout their history. As Kat read, the fire began to burn with colors that had nothing to do with the wood she'd used. Blue flames, green smoke, sparks that rose into the sky like messages being carried to distant spirits. And in the smoke, shapes began to form. Faces of people who'd lived and died on Newman's Ridge across the centuries. Mahala appeared last, her form more solid than the others. As if the power of her curse had preserved her consciousness across the decades, she looked exactly as Kat had seen her in dreams, tall, dignified, with eyes that held both infinite sadness and implacable determination. "You know the truth now," Mahala said, her voice carrying across the mountaintop like wind through the trees. "You understand what was done, what was lost, what was never acknowledged." Kat nodded, maintaining eye contact despite the supernatural terror that made her hands shake. "I understand, and I'm here to make it right." "How?" Mahala asked. "How do you propose to repair 2 centuries of injustice, to restore lives that were lost, to heal wounds that have festered for generations?" Kat held up the documents she'd prepared. Not just family histories, but a formal acknowledgement of wrongs committed, a recognition of Mahala's grief, and a commitment to ensure that the Melungeon story would be told accurately and completely. "I can't undo the past," Kat said, "but I can make sure the truth is preserved. Your daughter's story, your people's struggles, the injustices that drove you to seek supernatural justice. I can make sure future generations understand what happened here." Mahala studied the documents, her spectral form becoming more translucent as she read. "Words on paper. How do I know they will be honored when you're gone?" Kat reached into her jacket and pulled out a small vial of her own blood, mixed with ink made from plants that grew on Newman's Ridge. "I bind myself to this promise. My bloodline, my professional reputation, my life's work. If I fail to honor this commitment, let the curse fall on me instead." The ghost of Mahala Mullins smiled for the first time in 2 centuries. "You would take on the burden yourself, knowing what it has cost the Collins family?" "Someone has to break the cycle," Kat replied, "and someone has to tell the truth. I'm connected to this story through blood and research. If anyone can bear the responsibility, it should be me." Mahala nodded slowly, and Kat felt the supernatural pressure that had been building around her begin to ease. The curse hadn't been broken, it had been transferred, accepted willingly by someone who understood its purpose and committed to addressing its underlying cause. "Then let it be so," Mahala said. "But know this, the burden you carry is not just personal. You must ensure that the Melungeon people's story is told truthfully, that their struggles are recognized, that their children know their heritage without shame. Fail in this, and the curse will return stronger than before." The fire died suddenly, leaving Kat alone on the mountaintop with stars that seemed brighter than they should have been. She descended Newman's Ridge as dawn broke, carrying documents that had been transformed by supernatural fire into something more than mere paper and ink. Kat completed her research and delivered a comprehensive report to Jonathan Vardy, but she also began a larger project. Using her genealogical skills and professional connections, she started documenting Melungeon history in detail, creating archives that would preserve their stories for future generations. The curse's effects on the Collins family ended with Jonathan's generation. His business ventures began succeeding, his health improved, and he found the peace that his ancestors had been denied. But Kat carried the supernatural burden now, feeling its weight in the form of responsibility rather than retribution. She never married, never had children, dedicating her life to the promise she'd made to Mahala Mullins. Her research became the definitive record of Melungeon history, ensuring that future generations would understand the complex heritage and struggles of America's most mysterious mixed-race community. Catherine Morrison had started her career tracing bloodlines, but she ended it as a guardian of truth, carrying a supernatural obligation that connected her to both the living and the dead. The curse had been transformed from vengeance into purpose, and she bore it willingly, knowing that some responsibilities transcend individual lifetimes. On quiet nights, working alone in her archive, Kat sometimes felt Mahala's presence, not as a threat, but as a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied, and that truth has its own power to heal wounds that law and time cannot touch. Story 10. William Combs had been making music in these Kentucky mountains for 73 years, but he'd never played for an audience like the one gathering in his grandson's holler. The family reunion was supposed to be a celebration of 5 generations of Combs' blood, but Bill could feel something else building in the October air, something that had been waiting decades for the right moment, the right music, the right gathering of voices to call it home. The old fiddle felt heavier in his hands than it had in years past. Made by his great-grandfather in 1892, it had been passed down through 4 generations of mountain musicians, each adding their own songs to its memory. Bill had learned to play on this instrument, courted his wife with its melodies, and taught his children the old tunes that kept mountain traditions alive. But tonight felt different. The fiddle's strings hummed with harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than wood and metal. And when Bill tuned the instrument, he could swear he heard other voices tuning along with him, phantom musicians preparing for a performance that would bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The reunion had drawn Combs' family members from across the country. Cousins who'd moved to cities, grandchildren who barely remembered the mountain ways, great-grandchildren who'd never heard the old songs played on traditional instruments. Bill was the last keeper of the family's musical heritage, the only one who remembered all the verses, all the harmonies, all the stories that gave the songs their meaning. As evening fell and the family gathered around the fire pit, Bill took his usual place on the porch steps. 3 generations of Combs' faces looked up at him expectantly, waiting for the music that had always been the heart of family gatherings. But when Bill drew the bow across the strings, the sound that emerged wasn't quite his own. The melody was familiar, an old ballad about love and loss that his grandfather had taught him. But underneath his fiddle, other instruments joined in. A banjo picking out harmony lines, a guitar providing rhythm, voices humming along in perfect pitch. Bill's family heard only his fiddle, but he could distinguish every phantom instrument, every ghostly voice that had joined his performance. His grandfather appeared first, translucent but unmistakable, sitting in the chair where he'd always held court during family gatherings. The old man's hands moved in the familiar motions of playing banjo, though no physical instrument was visible. But Bill heard the banjo clearly, every note perfectly placed, every rhythm exactly as his grandfather had played it 60 years ago. Other family members began materializing as the music continued. Bill's father, dead 15 years, adding his rich baritone to the harmonies. His brother James, killed in Vietnam, contributing the guitar work that had made him locally famous before the war took him away. One by one, deceased relatives joined the spectral performance, each bringing their own musical gifts to a reunion that spanned both worlds. The living family members noticed something unusual happening, though they couldn't see what Bill saw. The music seemed to fill with more voices than could be accounted for by a single fiddle. Harmonies emerged from empty air, rhythm sections that had no visible source, melodies that layered and intertwined in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Bill's grandson Tommy, himself a talented musician, stopped his own guitar playing to listen more carefully. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "how are you making all those sounds? It's like there's a whole band playing along with you." Bill smiled, but didn't stop playing. How could he explain that the Dead Combs musicians were gathering for one final performance? That decades of family tradition had created a supernatural resonance that allowed the departed to join in the music they'd loved during life. The songs flowed seamlessly from one to another, following a progression that Bill had never planned, but that felt absolutely right. Mountain ballads that told stories of love and betrayal, work songs that celebrated the dignity of hard labor, hymns that spoke to the spiritual heart of Appalachian culture. Each piece carried the accumulated memory of everyone who'd ever sung it, creating layers of meaning that went far beyond the simple lyrics. As the performance continued, Bill began to understand what was happening. The supernatural gathering wasn't random. It was purposeful. The dead musicians were creating a bridge, offering him a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the Combs family's musical heritage. His grandfather spoke without interrupting the music, his voice reaching Bill's ears like wind through the mountains. "Time's come to make a decision, Billy. You can stay with the living, keep playing for audiences who don't understand the old ways. Or you can come with us, join the eternal performance where every song is perfect and every harmony lasts forever." Bill's bow never stopped moving, but his mind raced through the implications. Join his deceased relatives in whatever realm they inhabited, where music existed in its purest form, without the limitations of physical instruments or aging bodies. Or remain in the world of the living, watching his musical heritage fade as younger generations forgot the songs that had sustained their ancestors. The phantom musicians played with increasing intensity, their spectral performance growing more elaborate and beautiful with each passing moment. Bill could see the appeal of joining them. Perfect pitch, infinite repertoire, an audience of kindred spirits who understood the true power of mountain music. No more arthritic fingers, no more failing voice, no more watching tradition die with each passing year. But as Bill looked out at his living family, he saw something that gave him pause. His great-granddaughter Sarah, only 8 years old, was moving her fingers in time with the music, unconsciously mimicking the fingering patterns she'd seen him use on the fiddle. His nephew Marcus was humming along with harmonies he shouldn't have been able to hear. The music was working on them, planting seeds that might grow into the next generation of mountain musicians. Bill realized that the choice wasn't just personal, it was about legacy. If he left with the dead musicians, the family's musical tradition would die with him. But if he stayed, he might be able to pass along enough knowledge to keep the songs alive in new voices, new hands, new hearts that could carry the music forward into an uncertain future. The supernatural performance reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. Every deceased Combs musician was present now, creating a symphony that transcended anything possible in the physical world. The temptation to join them was almost overwhelming, to be part of something so perfect, so eternal, so free from the disappointments and limitations of mortal existence. But Bill made his choice. As the Phantom Symphony reached its peak, he began to change the melody, steering the music away from the otherworldly perfection toward something more human, more teachable. He simplified the arrangements, made them accessible to living voices and physical instruments. His grandfather's expression showed both disappointment and respect. "You're choosing to stay. I'm choosing to teach," Bill replied, never missing a note. "These songs need to live in the world, not just in memory." Someone has to show the young ones how to carry them forward. The spectral musicians began to fade as Bill's music returned fully to the realm of the living. But before they disappeared entirely, each one played a final phrase, a musical signature that seemed to imprint itself on the fiddle's strings. Gifts of melody and harmony that Bill could pass along to anyone willing to learn. As the last phantom note faded into the Kentucky night, Bill found himself alone on the porch steps with his fiddle and his living family. But the instrument felt different now, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. It carried the accumulated musical knowledge of 4 generations of Combs musicians, accessible to anyone who approached it with respect and dedication. Tommy was the first to speak. "Grandpa, I've never heard you play like that. It was like the fiddle was singing with voices I couldn't quite place." Bill smiled and held out the instrument. "Want to try? I think it might have some new songs to teach." Over the following months, Bill threw himself into musical education with renewed purpose. He taught Tommy the complex fingering patterns he'd learned from his grandfather. He showed Sarah how to hold the bow properly, how to draw sound from strings that seemed to remember every song they'd ever played. He worked with Marcus on the harmonies that had been passed down through generations of family gatherings. The fiddle responded to each new player differently, offering glimpses of the supernatural performance they'd witnessed that October night. When Tommy played, he could sometimes hear his great-grandfather's banjo accompanying him. When Sarah drew the bow across the strings, phantom voices hummed along with her simple melodies. Bill Combs lived another 5 years after the reunion, long enough to see the musical tradition take root in a new generation. When he finally passed, it was peacefully, in his sleep, with the fiddle resting in its case beside his bed. The family found him with a smile on his face, as if he'd heard music in his final moments that had called him home. At Bill's funeral, Tommy played the fiddle for the assembled mourners. As he worked through the old songs his grandfather had taught him, other family members joined in with voices and instruments, creating harmonies that seemed richer and more complex than their individual skills should have allowed. The phantom musicians were there too, visible only to those who knew how to listen with more than their ears. Bill had joined their eternal performance at last, but he'd also ensured that their music would continue, in the world of the living, carried forward by new voices that understood the true power of mountain songs. The fiddle remained in the family, passed down to whoever showed the greatest musical aptitude and dedication to preserving the old ways. Each new player discovered that the instrument carried more than just wood and strings. It held the musical memory of everyone who'd ever played it, a supernatural inheritance that connected past and future through the eternal language of song. William Combs had made his choice, and in choosing to teach rather than join the perfect performance of the dead, he'd ensured that the last song would never truly be the last. As long as there were hands to hold the fiddle and hearts to understand its music, the Combs family tradition would continue, bridging the gap between worlds through melodies that carried the soul of the mountains themselves. The mountains of Appalachia hold more secrets than any of us can imagine. These stories remind us that some places never forget their past, and some traditions run deeper than we dare to understand. Thank you for watching Sir Ravenclaw. Until next time, stay vigilant.